Hi everyone, I'm Sergio. I've been directing, DPing, doing visual effects in 3D for some time now, and today I'll be showing you a bunch of projects I use Blender on as a part of the pipeline as well as it being the core of it. But first, let me share some bits of my background. I had been playing electric guitar for over a decade, and in late 2012 I started discovering various visual disciplines. First it was fine art and entertainment design, then I started doing photography, then cinematography, directing, and then 3D and visual effects. Oops, meant to remove this slide. Now speaking of 3D, right about now is my 10th Blendiversary. And all in all, things finally clicked for me when I did this Dior thing back in 2016. And since then, my main focus has been commercials. Now I've done a bunch of narrative stuff as well, some shows, features, and a bunch of short films, but commercials tend to be a lot more flexible when it comes to pipelines and stuff like that. And here is a brief overview of various projects I use Blender on as a part of the pipeline. Most of these are commercials, there are some promos, music videos, and a Hawaiian TV show. My roles in these varied. The amount of Blender also varied. Sometimes I made entire environments, and sometimes it was as little as doing a camera track. Also, a couple of these projects had 3D folks who used different programs, but regardless of the nature of the project and regardless of the specific pipeline, Blender fits right in every single time. Not only that, Blender also saved a couple of projects without getting into specifics. Now I mentioned the word pipeline, and most of you are familiar with what it is. Just in case you aren't, it refers to the order of operations in production or post depending on the project, and here is a crude depiction of how it looks like sometimes. Is it the most efficient way of doing things? Well, it depends. Sometimes it works really well, and sometimes it's a little bit silly. And a couple of things have always seemed odd to me, one of them being that the amount of different programs involved in a typical pipeline can sometimes lead to different departments speaking different languages, which has demonstrable consequences regardless of the budget. And the other thing is this linear assembly line approach, which again works well sometimes, but at times it makes little sense if you think about it, because every department shares a common goal of making good-looking final images. Now, on the contrary, as some of you know, simplicity is divinity. And what I tend to do when I have the flexibility to do so looks something like this. And live-action projects are a little bit different, but everything else looks pretty much like this, where every shot starts in Blender, gets progressed in Blender. There are no migrations or exports out of Blender, with the only exception being animations for clothing sims if they are necessary, but then those simulations get imported right back in, so I don't know if it even counts. And as shots progress, all the auxiliary elements get imported along the way. And when the shots are done, they get rendered as usual in linear EXRs, and they go straight to the cut and grade. And whatever needs comping, and not every shot needs comping, goes through an additional step of the process. And also I have a tendency of rendering stills early on, way before any of the shots are done in 3D. I then send these stills to the grade. I do the grade and determine specifically whether I need to, say, cut a lamp by a half a stop or alter something, and so on. And if somebody wants to say, well, you can grade EXRs however you want. Well, for one, I'm going for very specific things. For two, I do color transforms in the grade. And finally, having filmed a ton of stuff, I would much rather acquire good negatives on the day rather than have to fix anything later. And this approach of doing preliminary grades way ahead of time, as well as building comping scripts before any of the 3D stuff is done, saves a whole lot of time down the road. And also this approach is a lot more collaborative, and given the nature of Blender, it allows for much greater interoperability within the team. Now we will circle back to this approach at the end, but now let's look at more images. Now we're moving into Blender being the core of the pipeline territory, and this is a recent example. The reason I'm not showing you this spot is because one of the scenes was made using a different program, and nobody wants to promote other programs here. If anyone's curious, the face is a plain shrink wrapped onto a mocap character. Nothing extravagant here. And now, finally, let's look at some projects. All the way back in 2018, there was this little spot.
First photograph on Mars. Mike Willis, the new Ansel Adams.
Man, it feels like forever ago, but I think it still holds up. Anyways, most of the spot we filmed on location, and the opening scene was filmed on a stage. And on a side note, in post-production, I created and rendered almost the entire commercial on a 2015 laptop on CPU. So the excuse of not having a powerful computer doesn't work, folks. Anyways, speaking of the first scene, I remember thinking, well, how do they simulate zero gravity in Hollywood? Well, of course they have wire rigs, duh. So a wire rig guy was hired, and well, what do you do when the wire rig doesn't meet your expectations? I thought, okay, I'm just going to photo scan the guy, because I had done it way back in 2015, and that's what ended up being the solution for it. Now let's watch an old breakdown, because everybody likes breakdowns. And shortly after I shipped the spot, it was screened in a couple of places despite being a commercial, one of them being the infamous TCL Chinese Theater on Hollywood Boulevard, which was awesome. It won a bunch of awards, and most notably a Clio statuette, which was a great honor. The point of all this is that back then I had no doubt about which software is the industry standard for 3D. Moving right along, here is a recent example, now a car spot. Oh, you're still here. Nothing fancy about the spot, but it does follow the above-mentioned pipeline to a T. Now, if we go back a few years, I made a commercial for a Twitch streamer. again, that was the first character I've ever made, and manually moving UVs on the head was not fun. But, most importantly, the overwhelming reaction of an online audience shy of 10,000 people inspired me to start working on an original episodic. And besides doing world building and script related stuff, I also made a little proof of concept teaser trailer for it.
Your Grace.
Glad you were able to come. Sit. According to my reports, a certain relic was left in a castle far west. I want you to retrieve it.
Why me?
In return, I can help you with the matter of locating your father.
Run! And don't look back.
Make haste. The ranger is waiting outside.
What wouldn't one do to free a family member from captivity?
Barbarians are roaming our lands and she's sending him.
First impressions can be deceiving.
Have you ever been outside of your kingdom? Can't say I have. It's a dangerous place.
We can't afford to lose a war.
Gather the troops. Any remaining sorcerers must hang.
It is in the darkness that we truly find the light.
What makes you think you are that which dies? Where are you folks traveling to? Obsidian Castle, past the mountain ridge. Many brave warriors went there, and none came back. A creature lurks inside those walls, and if it hears a stranger, it always wakes up.
Do you want to see some magic?
First of all, huge shout out to Sergio and Maurizio for making wonderful music and sound design for it. This project is currently in development, so if anyone's interested, please say hello. And overall, the teaser took a total of about 9 months of work, one person, one computer, nothing fancy. And now let's take a look at my approach here. This is a good example because this was one of the first characters I started making and one of the first shots I started working on. And so while I was sculpting the pores and grooming the eyebrows, I was thinking about the design of the costume, the final grade, and how the voice of the character should sound like. And the moment I was content with how the face looked, I went ahead, created the costume, brought it back in, and made another bajillion tests. And then I recorded the actor and started doing animation tests using the reference video he provided. Now, the original plan was to use a facial tracking solution, but sadly I ended up having to do everything by hand. And the moment I parked the camera there, I started rendering stills and doing grading tests. And this was the shot I was establishing my grading workflow on. And as you can see on these 8 examples, the light levels are almost identical here, and I was still tweaking the materials and lamps and so on, and I didn't even have the far background yet. But again, this approach saved a lot of time later on. And when it came to comping the final sequences, the comp itself was as simple as merging A over B with a couple of insignificant touch-ups that nobody else will ever notice. And then I did the grade utilizing one of the grades I had done way early on and just tweaking it to my liking. And when it came to environments, naturally it was a lot simpler. And again, all the grunt work was done in Blender. It was a matter of mixing different materials with masks or vertex colors. And in this case, I just comped in the fog that I rendered separately. But most shots, as in more than half of them, did not require any comping at all. And typically I worked on a few shots almost simultaneously, which not only helped me not get burnt out easily, but also it allowed me to progressively update the entire cut and focus on the big picture. And so all in all, wrapping things up, the projects we looked at today wouldn't have been possible without a few things. For one, the folks at the Blender team who are doing the hard work, unlike me. The second thing is, of course, the Blender community that keeps making add-ons and tutorials and resources. And the third thing is the understanding of various disciplines, which is the first thing I would like to highlight here. Because if you think about it, all these various disciplines are interconnected. And your understanding of grading, editing, cinematography, fine art, design, and so on can help not only improve your images, it can also make you indispensable in any pipeline, and most importantly, it allows you to make deliberate choices. Hence the expression, the difference between an intermediate and an expert is that an intermediate can get some great stuff and an expert can make some great stuff. Very big difference. Sadly, I don't remember who coined this phrase, but probably someone from production. And the reason I emphasize the word understand is because there's a huge difference between memorizing stuff and understanding it. Or as ancient Greeks would put it, episteme, i.e. empirical knowledge, is the beginning of understanding, but not its end. And what seems to be the case nowadays is that some people look something up and then they hear or read someone's opinion, or they may read some empirical facts, and they end right there. Now, some opinions and empirical data can be great stepping stones towards understanding, but these things in and of themselves are fundamentally memorization, which is short-term and literal, unlike understanding. And of course, one of the cornerstones of understanding is first-hand experience. And by that, I don't mean merely repeating someone else's steps, but getting your hands dirty and actively studying these disciplines. And in that process, you're not only able to discover underlying nuances of a given discipline, but most importantly, you're able to understand yourself better. And when people ask, how do I find my style? Well, this is a good place to start, because in that process, you start identifying various nuances that are attractive to you, and over time, you start forming your own little thing, i.e. a style. And the reason I'm being vague here is because nobody knows what you want except for you. And it is your duty to nurture your curiosity and to keep looking for answers. That's how we grow, that's how we understand things, and that's how we understand ourselves. Sadly, this is where we have to wrap up, but I hope that some of you found this presentation useful, and I thank you for your time.